Victorians were afraid of cemeteries not because of death, but because of those who came after midnight. When the city fell asleep and the gas lamps went out one by one, the cemeteries were no longer a place of peace. There, work began. Not shouting, not rushing, but quiet, methodical work, under the cover of fog and silence. The graves were not opened for the sake of memory, and not out of hatred. They were opened for the sake of knowledge. The bodies disappeared, and in the morning no one asked questions, because everyone understood there are things that are better left silent. In this story, there are no heroes and no monsters. There is only night and people who used what it hides. This is a story about body snatchers, nighttime body snatchers in Victorian England. And if you think that death was the scariest part of this story, you haven't heard what happened next. When the city fell asleep, at midnight, London changed. Not abruptly, without signals, without bells. It was just that at some point, the noise of the daytime city began to recede. The wheels of the carriages fell silent. The footsteps on the pavement became rare. The windows, one by one, went out, as if the city itself was slowly closing its eyes. But the night in Victorian England was never empty. It was a working one. While most people were asleep, someone went out into the streets, not for a walk, not for fun, and not for crime in the sense in which we are accustomed to imagine it. They went to places where even during the day they tried not to linger, to cemeteries, places that seemed calm, almost solemn during the day, turned into another world at night, a world of shadows, fog, and earth that hadn't yet settled. There was no light here, except for the weak yellow flame of a lantern. There were no witnesses, and there was no room for error, because silence was the main rule, not because it was valued, but because any sound could cost freedom, and sometimes life. Imagine this scene. Dead night, cold air, a lantern, clutched in a hand, shines downwards, never upwards. The shovel enters the earth slowly, without sudden movements. They don't dig quickly, they dig carefully, because this is no ordinary work, and no ordinary earth. What lies beneath it, a few hours ago, had a name. It had a family. It had a history. But that night it became a commodity. In Victorian England, bodies were needed, not for rituals, not for secret cults, but for science. Medicine was developing rapidly. Surgeons wanted to know more. Universities demanded training on real cases. And the law could not keep up with the demand. Officially, obtaining a body for anatomical research was almost impossible. Execution? Scarce. Permits? Limited. The number of students? Growing every year. And where there is a demand, there is always someone ready to satisfy it. Thus was born a nocturnal profession. Without signs, without advertisements, without names. They were called by different names: grave robbers, night diggers, body snatchers. But they rarely called themselves anything at all, because names were superfluous. The only thing that mattered was to do the job and disappear before dawn. These people didn't look like monsters. By day, they might be dock workers, butchers, coachmen, ordinary city dwellers. But at night, they would take a lantern and a shovel and go where even the police preferred not to appear without a reason. The cemeteries of Victorian England were overcrowded. Cities grew faster than burial grounds. Graves were close together, sometimes in several layers. fresh earth was light, and that was what interested the night diggers. Not old burials, not bones, but what hadn't yet become part of the soil. The work didn't last long, but every minute seemed longer than an hour, because any sound could mean the end. A watchman, a passerby, a patrol, and then the lantern would be extinguished. A shovel would be thrown, and they would disappear among the tombstones as if they had never been here. The city would wake up in the morning, and the night would hide its secrets again. But not everyone. From time to time, someone would notice. The grave had been disturbed. The earth was not lying right. The stone had shifted a little. And then what the Victorians feared most returned to the city. Not death, but its disturbance. The fear that even after burial, peace was not guaranteed. It was from this fear that panics began. It was he who led to the guards with guns, to the metal cages above the graves, to the night watch. But the demand didn't go away, and the night shift continued. There are no simple heroes in this story, and there are no clear-cut villains. There is only a city that grew too fast, a science that demanded more than the law allowed, and the people who found a way to fill that gap. Today we will follow them, slowly, without rushing, step by step. We will walk through the nocturnal cemeteries of Victorian England. We will look into the dark coffins, and we will understand why this practice existed for so long, and why it left such a deep mark on the memory of the city. This is a story that was not told out loud, a story that everyone knew, but pretended it did not exist. This is the story of the grave robbers of Victorian England, and it is just beginning. Work that could not be seen. To understand the night body snatchers, you need to abandon the idea of chaos. These were not random robberies. There was no shouting, there was no rush. This was work. Quiet, deliberate, almost artisanal. The night diggers did not come at random. They knew where to go. They knew when to go. And, most importantly, they knew what not to do. The very first rule was silence. Not absolute, not perfect, but enough to blend into the night. The shovel was not driven into the ground abruptly. The earth was not thrown. It was carefully put aside, layer by layer, so that in the morning everything could be put back almost in place. The second rule was speed without haste. Paradoxical, but that's how it was. Too fast meant noise. Too slow meant risk. The diggers moved in a rhythm that only came with experience. It was the rhythm of night work, where every move mattered. The third rule was no traces. The body was not pulled out with the coffin. The coffin was opened. The lid was put away. Anything that could give the impression of integrity was left behind. In some cases, sandbags were even put back, so that the coffin would not appear empty. Sometimes it was clothes. Sometimes it was nothing. This was not looting. This was camouflage. Because the most dangerous thing was not to be caught red-handed, but to let the city know that this was happening regularly. Fear is noise. Panic is attention. And attention is the end. That's why the night body snatchers worked as if they didn't exist. They didn't take jewelry. They didn't touch tombstones. They didn't break crosses. They were only interested in one thing, that which had no voice and could not resist. They most often worked in pairs. One watched, the other dug. The cemetery guards were not enemies, but variable conditions. They studied them. They knew the routes. They knew when they lingered longer at the entrance and when they went to distant areas. Sometimes the night diggers paid. Sometimes they negotiated. Sometimes they just waited. Because the night is always longer than it seems. These people were not romantic criminals. They weren't looking for adrenaline. Most of them didn't want to be here. But they knew what they were doing. For one body, you could get more than a week of hard physical labor at the port, and sometimes more than a month. The money was fast, and the risk was constant. And that's why there was an unspoken ethic among the diggers. They didn't work on other people's land. They didn't cross the border without agreement. They didn't take anything that might attract unnecessary attention, because the night didn't forgive mistakes. If something went wrong, there was no time to explain. They put out the lantern, they quit their job, and they disappeared. Sometimes forever. The city might not know their names, but it felt their presence. Rumors traveled faster than newspapers. People began to put stones, iron cages over the graves, hire night watchmen, and with each such step, the night work became more difficult. But it did not disappear, because the reason was deeper than fear. The demand remained. And while the bodies were waiting in the anatomical halls, someone went out into the night with a lantern and a shovel, where the bodies disappeared. At night, the bodies disappeared. And during the day, they appeared. Not in cemeteries, and not in homes. They appeared where the light was brighter, where the floor was cleaner, where the voices sounded more confident. In the anatomy rooms. These were rooms that looked almost dignified during the day. Long tables, bookshelves, windows that let in light from the right side. Here they talked about knowledge, about progress, about science, and almost never about the night. Medical students gathered here with focused faces. They came to learn, to look, to understand. They were told that anatomy was the basis of everything, that without it, it was impossible to become a surgeon, that true healing begins with an understanding of the human body. And that was true. But there was something else that was also true. The bodies lying on the tables did not appear there on their own. It was not talked about in lectures. It was not written in textbooks. And it was not discussed over tea. The origin of the body was considered unimportant. All that mattered was that it was here, and that it was fresh. In Victorian England, anatomical schools grew faster than the law could keep up with them. The number of students increased every year. The number of bodies allowed did not. Officially, only the bodies of executed criminals were allowed for study. But executions were becoming fewer. Society was changing. Public gallows were disappearing, and the need for education was not. And then there was silence. The silence of agreements. The silence of indirect questions. The silence that did not demand answers. The anatomists did not ask where the body came from. The suppliers did not explain how they got it. Money passed from hand to hand, and everyone pretended that night did not exist. These operations did not take place in basements, not in secret rooms, often simply through the back door. Early in the morning, before the city had yet woken up, the body was wrapped, carefully, without unnecessary movements, and not because they were respectful, but because haste spoiled the material. There was no shouting in this system. There was no panic. There was only cold efficiency. And the more respectable the educational institution, the fewer questions were asked there, because knowledge demanded sacrifice, and no one wanted to know which ones. The students watched. They took notes. They studied. Some turned away. Some got used to it. Some became better doctors precisely because of this experience. And therein lay the main moral trap of the era. Because the results were real. Operations became more precise. There were fewer mistakes. People began to survive where they had previously died. And no one wanted to stop to ask a question that could destroy the entire system. Who was lying on the table? Whose body was this? Was it given voluntarily? These questions were left at the door. Even those doctors who sincerely believed in humanism rarely looked into the dark side of their profession, because if you looked there too long, you could see yourself. And then it was no longer possible to work quietly. Some schools tried to create their own legal channels. They made agreements with hospitals. They sought permits. But this was not enough. The bodies still came in from the night, and everyone who worked in the light became part of the shadow. This shadow did not scream. It simply existed. And the city knew about it. Newspapers wrote cautiously from time to time, with hints, without names. The public was outraged, but quickly calmed down, because everyone wanted to live longer, and no one wanted to know at what cost. When the dead needed protection. At first, people didn't believe it. A single disturbed grave seemed like a coincidence. A displaced stone was the work of rain. Uneven ground was the result of haste during the burial. The Victorians didn't want to think that after saying goodbye, the peace could be disturbed. But over time, such coincidences became more frequent. Someone noticed that the ground above the grave looked different than it did yesterday. Someone found footprints. Someone heard a night sound that they couldn't explain. And then fear began to slowly penetrate the city. Not suddenly, not as panic, but as a constant feeling of anxiety. People began to talk to each other, at first in whispers, then louder, in taverns, in markets, in queues outside churches. They talked about night people, about lanterns among the tombstones, about shadows moving where there shouldn't be movement. The newspapers picked up the topic cautiously. No direct accusations, no details, just brief notes, hints, questions without answers. But that was enough, because the worst fear is the one that is not given a name. Families began to act. Stones appeared over the fresh graves, heavy, rough, as if deliberately clumsy. Some installed iron bars, some entire cages that covered the graves from all sides. They were called mort safes. They looked unnatural. The dead behind bars, the living at large. But fear changes the idea of normal. Cemeteries that were once places of silence began to resemble fortifications, with locks, with chains, with guards. Night watchmen were hired not for peace, but for vigilance. They were paid to stay awake, to listen for every sound, to be ready to make noise. But noise was precisely what the night diggers knew how to avoid best. They watched. They waited. They studied new routes. Where guards appeared, the work became more difficult, but not impossible. Sometimes the guard got tired. Sometimes took money. Sometimes simply didn't want to see. Because guarding the dead every night is a job that breaks even the living. A new feeling had come over the city. Nothing was guaranteed, even after death. It was outrageous. It was frightening. And it made them demand answers. Politicians began to talk about laws, churches about morality, newspapers about shame. But between words and actions was the same gap that had given birth to the nocturnal profession: demand. While the anatomical schools needed bodies, no cage could be reliable enough, and the city felt it. Rumors began to spread about families who would stand guard at graves for several nights in a row, about people who would not go home until the ground had settled sufficiently. Some believed that the danger would pass in a week, some that in a month, and some that never. Death was no longer the end. It became a transition into a risk zone, and this changed the perception of the world. The dead no longer belonged only to memory. They became part of the economy, invisible, night. In this chapter of history, it is important to understand one thing. The city was not defenseless. It fought, but it fought the consequences, not the cause. And as long as the cause remained, the night continued to work. When the night became insufficient. For a long time, the system held, not on the law, not on morality, but on balance. The demand was high. The risk was acceptable. The night diggers worked carefully, and the city pretended not to notice. But balance is a fragile thing. Every year, anatomical schools expanded. The number of students grew. So did the number of classes. The bodies that were considered sufficient yesterday no longer covered the needs today. The night was running out. The cemeteries were better guarded. Families were more vigilant. Newspapers wrote more boldly. And at some point, the usual digging became too risky. That's when some people took a step further. It wasn't a sudden transition. There was no collective decision. Only isolated cases, isolated thoughts, isolated excuses. If the body is needed, if science can't wait, if it happens anyway. Such phrases were not spoken aloud, but they existed. In dark rooms, in quiet conversations, in looks that avoided the light. Some began to pay attention to the lonely, to the poor, to those for whom no one would come. These were not random victims. These were people whom society had already learned not to see. Travelers, the homeless, drunkards, people without families. Their disappearance did not cause immediate alarm. And that was what made the situation dangerous. The line between night theft and deliberate violence became thinner than ever. Not all night diggers followed this path. Most didn't. But a few were enough to cause the whole system to crack. Rumors spread through the cities about bodies that didn't make it through the cemetery, about fresh material that appeared too quickly, about people who disappeared without a trace. At first, it seemed like an exaggeration, urban folklore, a scarecrow for children. But over time, the coincidences became too much. And then the fear changed form. It wasn't fear for the dead anymore. It was fear for the living. A lantern at night no longer meant just grave robbing. It could mean a trap. Observation, expectation. The city began to look at the darkness differently. The same streets that seemed familiar during the day became suspicious at night. Any stranger could be dangerous. Any shadow was too long. And that's when the story of the nocturnal body snatchers ceased to be just a story about disturbing the peace. It became a story about murder. But it's important to understand, this was not a mass practice. It was not the norm. It was a deviation that appears in any system when demand grows faster than control. And it was these deviations that forced society to take a more honest look at itself. Because it became obvious, the problem is not only with the nocturnal diggers. The problem is with the silence that allowed them to exist, when silence no longer protected. Every system has a limit, not the one written into the rules, and not the one publicly acknowledged, but the one beyond which silence becomes complicity. For Victorian England, that limit was crossed when disappearances ceased to be isolated. People began to notice the absence. Not immediately, not dramatically. First, an empty bed in a cheap room. Then, a job that no one showed up for. Then, an acquaintance who hadn't been seen for days. In a city where thousands disappeared every year, this didn't seem strange. But now the disappearances began to form a pattern. Not everyone saw it at once. Not everyone wanted to see it. Because the pattern meant that the danger was no longer confined to cemeteries. It had come out into the streets. Newspapers began to write more boldly. Without names, without evidence, but the tone changed. The words became more disturbing. The questions were more direct. The hints were clearer. Is it safe to walk around the city at night? Where do lonely people disappear to? Can science justify silence? These texts were read over breakfast, and then they folded the newspaper and tried not to think about them, because thinking was scary. The police found themselves between two worlds. On the one hand, public pressure. On the other, respect for doctors and educational institutions, which were considered the pride of the nation. To accuse openly meant to cast a shadow on all progress. And not to accuse meant to leave people without protection. Therefore, the investigation was conducted cautiously, slowly, almost reluctantly. Night arrests, silent interrogations. Cases disappeared. But fear already took on a life of its own. People began to change their habits. They returned home earlier. They avoided dark alleys. They walked in pairs. What had once been only a cemetery horror became an urban one. And that changed everything. For when fear touches the living, it can no longer be ignored. Churches spoke louder. Sermons became darker. Moral arguments sounded sharper. Newspapers stopped being cautious. Names appeared. Suspicions arose. The anatomical schools felt for the first time that the shadow that had fed them could destroy them. Some of the doctors began to make excuses, some to remain silent, some to distance themselves. But silence no longer worked, because the silence that had previously protected everyone now looked like evidence. At that moment, a new figure emerged, not a night digger and not a doctor, but a witness, someone who had seen more than he wanted to, someone who spoke not out of conviction, but out of fear. These voices were quiet, uncertain, often contradictory, but they were enough to wake up society. And then the inevitable happened. What had existed in the shadows for years came to light. Not immediately, not completely, but enough to make people ask, who is really to blame? Those who dug at night? Or those who paid during the day when the names were called? Sooner or later, the silence always ends. Not because someone dares to speak first, but because the silence becomes too loud. In Victorian England, this moment did not come suddenly. It crept up gradually, through rumors, through fear, through stories that no longer fit into private conversations. When the first names came, the city froze. Not all of them were real. Not all of them were verified. But the fact of the names themselves was new, because until then, the nocturnal body snatchers had existed as shadows, without faces, without biographies, without the possibility of being held accountable. Now the shadows had outlines. Newspapers began to print more voluminous, with details that yesterday had been considered inappropriate. They wrote about night interrogations, about suspects seen near cemeteries, about people who had suddenly disappeared from the city. And although many of these materials were cautious, their tone was different. These were no longer hints. These were accusations. The police were under pressure, not only from society, but also from those who demanded quick answers. Arrests began, not mass, not showy, but selective. They detained those who were easier to detain, those who had no defense, those whose disappearances would not cause a scandal. But even that was enough for the fear to change direction. Now it was not only the living who were afraid. Now those who had worked in the shadows for years were also afraid. The night diggers began to disappear. Some left the city. Some changed their occupations. Some simply disappeared. And with them disappeared the illusion that this practice could continue indefinitely. The courtrooms filled with people, not only the accused, but also spectators. Because these trials were more than trials. They were an attempt to understand how far society had come. The questions were asked cautiously, sometimes too cautiously. Who dug? Who paid? Who knew and kept quiet? But far from all of these questions were answered, because if we were to name all the guilty, we would also have to name those whom society preferred to consider heroes: doctors, teachers, scientists, those who saved lives during the day and closed their eyes at night. Therefore, the truth came out in doses, limited, controlled. Some were convicted, some were released, some were never touched. But even that was enough to cause the system to begin to collapse, because fear was no longer one-sided. Now everyone was afraid. The city understood that the problem would not go away on its own. That night would not cease to exist until day changed. At that moment, an idea emerged that had seemed impossible yesterday: to change the law, not to silence, not to tolerate, but to rebuild the system itself. This decision was not quick, and it was not unanimous, but it became inevitable, because once the names were named, there was no going back to silence, a law that came too late. When a system breaks down, the first reaction is always to try to fix it, not to rethink it, not to take it apart, to fix it, by leaving as much as possible unchanged. In Victorian England, this attempt took the form of a law. The idea seemed simple, humane even. If medicine needed bodies, they should be provided legally. No night, no shadows, no lanterns among graves. The law promised order. Bodies for anatomical studies were to come from hospitals, from asylums, from places where people died without families or the possibility of being buried otherwise. On paper, it looked like a compromise. In practice, it was a new form of silence. For while the law closed one darkness, it opened another. People began to ask, who exactly had the right to the body now? Who decided whether a death was lonely enough? The answers were vague, and it was dangerous. The poor were the first to understand this. For them, the law did not become a protection. It became a warning. To die without a family meant the risk of losing not only life, but also peace after death. Some began to fear hospitals, some of asylums, some of the very fact of illness. For now the nocturnal threat had moved into the daytime walls. And although the body snatchers had disappeared from the cemeteries, the fear did not disappear with them. It simply changed form. The anatomical schools breathed a sigh of relief. Now they didn't have to ask questions. Everything looked legal, official, clean. But the moral tension did not go away. Because now the question sounded differently. Does the state have the right to decide the fate of the body after death? And if so, where does the line draw? These discussions were not held at night. They were heard during the day, in Parliament, in newspapers, in churches. But, as before, most people preferred not to delve into it, because the truth was inconvenient. Medicine really saved more lives. Operations became more precise. Knowledge became deeper. And at the same time, this knowledge had its price, a price paid by those who had no voice. The law did not destroy the shadow. It simply made it less visible. Nightlights disappeared from cemeteries, but the silence remained. Now it lived in documents, in the wording, in the small print. And the city gradually got used to it, as one always gets used to a new order, which seems more stable than the old chaos. But the memory did not disappear. People still looked around as they passed the cemeteries. They still remembered the stories. They still felt that the line between science and fear was never clear. What remained after? When the night lights went out, it seemed that the story was over. The cemeteries were silent again. The graves were still. The city was more confident in its own safety. But there are things that do not disappear with practice. They remain in memory. Victorian England quickly learned to live on, as if the nighttime body snatchers were just an unfortunate episode, as if the law was enough to erase years of fear. But memory works differently. It does not live in documents. It lives in pauses, in looks, in the way people avoid certain places. Even after the disappearance of the nocturnal profession, the cemeteries remained a space of tension. There people still spoke in whispers. There people still did not linger unnecessarily. Not because anyone expected danger, but because memory does not need evidence. Images began to appear in urban legends. Not specific names, but types. A man with a lantern, a shadow between tombstones, the sound of a shovel, which only those who have been awake for too long can hear. These stories were passed down not as facts, but as warnings. Children were told not to walk at night, not to approach cemeteries, not to look at the light in the fog. And even those who had never seen night diggers felt that this was not fiction, because every city remembers exactly where its borders were violated. Literature picked up on this topic quickly, not directly, not documentary, with allegories, with images, with metaphors. Night crime became a symbol, not so much of a specific practice, as of a fear that science might go too far. And there was something very Victorian about this fear. The age of progress is always afraid of its own dark side, because the brighter the light, the deeper the shadow. Even doctors who were already working in new conditions sometimes recalled the past with tension, not because they regretted it, but because they understood that their profession was built on silence, which was not always voluntary. Universities gradually began to change their tone, talking about ethics, about consent, about boundaries. But these conversations did not arise from nothing. They emerged from experiences that they did not want to repeat. This is how the memory of an era is formed, not as an official narrative, and as an internal signal. You can't return here anymore. But even this signal is not absolute. Each new generation asks the same questions again and again. Is the victim justified? Where is the line between benefit and violence? Who has the right to decide? And each time the answer seems obvious, until the circumstances change. That is why the story of the nocturnal body snatchers never completely disappeared. It returns in films, in novels, in night conversations, not as an instruction, but as a warning, because it reminds that civilization is not only progress. It is a constant struggle with one's own temptations. The mirror an era wouldn't look into. Stories that survive their own time rarely do so through details. They survive through questions. The story of the nocturnal body snatchers became precisely that, not because it was uniquely brutal, but because it exposed a boundary that society preferred not to think about. Victorian England loved order. It believed in hierarchy, in rules, in clearly defined roles. But beneath this orderliness there was tension. For progress demanded more than morality would allow, and morality could not keep up with the speed of change. Medicine was a symbol of light. It promised healing, prolongation of life, salvation from pain. And that is precisely why it did not want to see its light cast a shadow. The night body snatchers did not arise out of cruelty. They arose out of necessity, out of need for material, out of need for knowledge, out of need for something that could not be obtained otherwise. And that makes this story uncomfortable, because if they were just criminals, everything would be simple. But they were a symptom of a system that had learned to take, but not to ask. Victorian society was extraordinarily sensitive to form and extraordinarily patient with content. As long as everything looked decent, questions could be postponed. As long as the operating rooms were clean, it didn't matter where the body came from. As long as the students were learning, it didn't matter whose memory was impaired. And that is the main lesson of the era. For the story of the nocturnal body snatchers is not about the night. It is about the day. The daytime decisions that create nocturnal professions. The daytime compromises that demand silence after sunset. When the law finally came, it was not a victory for morality. It was an admission of failure. The recognition that society had enjoyed the results for too long without wanting to know about the process. And even after the law, the questions did not disappear. They merely changed form. Who has the right to the body after death? Can benefit outweigh consent? Is there a lesser evil in systems that save lives? These questions did not remain in the 19th century. They have moved on. In the 20th century, in the 21st. The technologies have changed. The terms have changed. The tools have changed. But the logic has remained. When society wants a result, but doesn't want to pay the real price, a shadow appears. And this shadow will always be someone's work. That's why the story of the nocturnal body snatchers cannot be a closed chapter. It is a reminder, not about how bad the people of the past were, but about how familiar their excuses are. For every era believes that its compromises are temporary, and everyone is surprised when these compromises leave traces. Victorian England saw itself as the pinnacle of civilization, and in many ways that was true. But civilization is not the absence of darkness. It is the ability to look at it directly. And that is precisely what it lacked then, when silence became unacceptable. Stories rarely change the world at once. They act slowly. They accumulate. They settle. So it was with the story of the nocturnal body snatchers. It did not end with a law. It did not end with the courts. And it did not even end with the disappearance of lanterns among the graves. It moved into another plane, into the plane of doubt. Doctors who had been trained after the changes entered the anatomical halls differently, not with triumph, but with a certain caution. Now the question of the origin of the body was no longer considered superfluous. It was not always spoken aloud, but it no longer disappeared without a trace. Gradually, a new feeling emerged. Knowledge cannot exist without responsibility. It was not a discovery. Rather, it was a recognition of what had long been felt, but not enough words. Medical ethics was not born from a single decision. It was not imposed by decree. It was shaped by discomfort, from the feeling that some things could no longer be done the way they used to be, even if they were effective, even if they were convenient, even if they worked. Universities began to talk about consent, cautiously at first, as an exception, as an ideal. But ideals have the property of becoming requirements. The first formal rules appeared, not ideal, not comprehensive, but important. The body ceased to be simply material. It began to reclaim its human status, even after death. This shift was imperceptible from the outside. There were no revolutions. There were no mass protests. But within the profession, it was felt very clearly. Old doctors sometimes sighed, calling the new rules excessive. Young people listened more attentively, because it was the young who had to live with the consequences of this history, and with the memory of what happens when efficiency becomes more important than limits. Interestingly, the greatest impact of this history was not on medicine as a science, but on medicine as a relationship. The relationship between doctor and patient, between society and knowledge, between benefit and trust. Because trust is the most fragile resource, it can be lost overnight and restored over generations. The Victorian era lost some of this trust and paid for it with a long shadow. But that is precisely why it was able to teach us a lesson. Not in the form of ready-made answers, but in the form of questions that can no longer be ignored. Does progress have limits? Who sets these limits? And what happens when they disappear into silence? These questions are not outdated. They have only changed context. The story of the nocturnal body snatchers became the foundation for a new sensitivity. to understand that permitted and possible are not the same, and that silence that once seemed neutral is in fact always a choice. When the night finally let go. Every story ends at some point, even those that lived in the shadows for a long time. The nighttime body snatchers disappeared in more than one moment. There was no last lantern. There was no final blow of the shovel. They simply ceased to be needed. This is the quietest ending imaginable. When a system changes so much that it no longer needs its shadows, the shadows dissolve by themselves. Cemeteries once again became a place of memory, not without fear, but without the constant expectation of violation. City nights regained a different meaning. They once again became a night of rest, and not working time for those who acted between law and necessity. But history did not disappear with practice. It remained in archives, in memories, in urban legends, which over time lost their sharpness, but not their meaning. Because the meaning of this story was never about shovels and lanterns. It was about elections, in choosing not to see, in choosing to be silent, in choosing to use the result without asking about the way. And that is why this story remains important today, not as a condemnation and not as a horror, but as a reminder that every era has its night professions, not necessarily literal, but always convenient. Those that appear where demand precedes ethics, where the result is valued above consent, where silence seems easier than conversation. Victorian England was convinced that it was moving forward, and it really was moving. But this story shows that moving forward does not always mean moving up. Sometimes it's a movement through darkness that someone has to illuminate, even if no one wants to see it. Today, we have words for what silence was then. We have the concept of consent. We have ethics committees. We have rules. But most importantly, we have memory. The memory of what happens when convenience becomes more important than humanity. And perhaps that's why this story is no longer as frightening as it once was. It doesn't make you shiver. It makes you think. And that's much more important. The body snatchers of the night are a thing of the past, but the questions they raised are still with us. And every time we decide not to ask questions, it's worth remembering this story. Not for fear, but for mindfulness. Because civilization is not the absence of dark sides. It is the ability to not let them work in silence. If this quiet story has helped you to stop, breathe, or look at the past differently, you can support the channel by subscribing, liking, or leaving a calm comment. Please write where you are listening to this story from. I read every message. And if such slow night stories are close to you, we still have many stories waiting for their time. Thank you for being here, and good silence to you.